Welcome to the Threaded Zebra Podcast. This is a very special episode, our first, and we're kicking it off with an amazing guest, author, speaker, and songwriter Justin McRoberts. The common theme of the podcast will be about marketing and advertising, but we're excited to explore how marketing is part of the fabric of our lives and an essential piece of the greater social conversation that involves storytelling and how we engage with others. We'll be talking to a whole host of guests across multiple professions, from visual artists to musicians to writers, and from business owners to technology developers. We hope over the course of the episodes to explore how these varied and various elements all work together and affect each other, and how advertising and marketing are evolving while their center remains rooted in human interaction. Now, here is our first episode. Enjoy! So here we are with the inaugural episode of the Threaded Zebra Agency podcast. We're thrilled to be speaking with Justin McRoberts today. Hello, Justin.
Hey, man. How you doing?
Good.
Awesome.
So I want to introduce Justin. He's a storyteller and a songwriter who has recorded 15 albums since his debut in 1999. Not everyone will recognize them, but it's kind of a big deal to me, and maybe to some of our listeners. You played with Five Iron Frenzy.
True. Did that.
Yep. Justin's also an author and a speaker, having written 3 books and has a new audiobook out now, Your Creative Process, Q&A audiobook of sorts. We'll have a link to that on our page so you can check it out.
Great.
So, Justin, I want to talk to you today about the audiobook. There's a section in there where you get asked about emotion in relation to your creative process. And you say something that I've been thinking a lot about the last couple of years, that culturally we want to divorce ourselves from emotion. I think a lot of people don't want to be seen as making any decisions that stem from an emotional response.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, and the question, though, it came to me, I'd shared about getting to a place in a person's creative process, I'll speak on my own behalf, getting to a place in my creative process in which I had some emotional distance from what I was doing. That one of the primary obstacles to making good work is that I'm so attached to the thing I'm making, I have a hard time critiquing it or knowing where to go next. Whereas, as much as I might desperately love Amy Mann as a songwriter, I can listen to some of her records or some of her songs and think, this is kind of crap. Like, this one's actually a little bit crap. This one is not crap. And the difference is I have an emotional distance. She's a superior songwriter. Like, she's far better than I'll ever be as a songwriter. But I can still critique her work because I know song and because I have some emotional distance. So my encouragement to the room full of college students was, figure out ways to get some emotional distance, to finish your work, put it down, know that it kind of sucks a little bit, and then come back to it. The follow-up question to that, which was great, he said, the question was like, it seems like you're asking me to turn off my emotions and I was like, well, it's a great clarification, because no, like, you want to be emotionally attached to what you're doing. You just don't want your emotions to drive the thing. And I think that's what we freak out about when we talk about emotional decision making.
Yeah.
I think there ought to be a degree of humanity and like, not the wrong kind of anxiety, but a little bit of like, you should, like Seth Godin talks about when he talks about art, there should be that sort of dual question in your mind, like, this might work, this might not work. Mm-hmm. Like, there should be that sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure. There should be some emotion tied into it. I should care about the people on the other side of what I'm doing, but I don't want to necessarily let those emotions drive the thing. So it's kind of the sort of, it's not like a double-edged sword. I don't know what the image is here, but it's like, on the one end, there's overly emotional work that is so about what's happening in the internal psychology of the person who made it that it's completely and totally inaccessible. You're like, bro, this is about you and your breakup. And I get that it sucks, but I just can't care the way you do. Sure. And then there's the other side of it that's like, it's so cold and distant and it's mathematical. It's the issue people have with a lot of like with some bad pop music where there just isn't enough humanity and emotion expression in it. So like emotion has to play a role, but just a role. And the role can't be like, with, its hands around the wheel and its foot on the pedal.
Yeah, I always think about the golden mean, finding a balance.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important, and I think people try to divorce emotion from decision making a lot of times, but that emotion is what I think drives the initial decisions that we make.
Yeah. Well, it's why you go in, right? I mean, like, there's that sort of biblical principle of remembering your first love and all that. Like, there's something to, you getting so locked in on execution, not that it doesn't matter, but you get so locked in on execution that you forget your heart. Like, you literally leave your heart in the background because you get locked in on crushing it and doing it super well. And you forget why. You forget why you do it. And the why is an emotional question. It's always an emotional question. Like, why you do what you do, any of the work you do in your life that actually matters. You do it because there's this emotional tie to it and you actually care. So
Absolutely.
Forgetting that is problematic long term.
Yeah, I agree. So, okay, at another point in your audiobook, you talk about how community helps you make great art. I've worked in advertising for about a decade, and that also involves a creative process and, uses elements of art. And I think that element of community is something that has become increasingly important in the advertising industry, especially with social media, active engagement of audience. How does feedback from your audience influence your work?
It kind of ties into the first bit of the conversation that, again, I don't think I'm rare in this. Like, I honestly do care what other people think about what I make. I don't get possessed by it, but I care about the people who consume my books and my music. And it's a way for me to love my world. It's a way for me to love those people. It's a way for me to love my neighbors. And so if it's not connecting, I'll change what I'm doing. Not a matter of just, if it's not selling, then we got to change it to sell it. If it's not connecting, then I want to change it. Or if it is connecting, then I found out like, oh, this is something that really does land with these people or that I do really well. So one of them, figuring out over the course of time, again, what I'm good at and how what I'm good at actually makes the most impact and has the biggest positive effect on people. That's all about, like, I can't decide that. I don't get to decide how well received my work is. Someone else gets to decide that. And there's like, and I get like, I've not always been good at this. I'm not great at this. But there's like this relinquishing of power there where like I turn things over to this tribe, this, audience, this community of people, and they get to say, hey, let's do more of this, or hey, let's not do more of this. And then they become part of my creative process. That's how it's played over the course of years with even, I'll say like this is maybe the best example that I can think of right now. Not necessarily the best example, but the best example I came up with right now is the transition from doing a lot of music and some writing to doing a lot of writing and some music in my life.
Okay.
Mostly had to do with how I was being received by my community, by my audience, by my tribe. I was paying attention, like what's landing with people and what are they wanting from me? What are they asking for? And I could have said in my, hey, I'm an artist. I'm a pure artist. I'm a musician. I'm a songwriter. And I know these are things that you want from me, but I'm going to do what's in me to do. I could have gone that route. But what I say it like this, what they were seeing in me was also important. Like, I didn't see this in me that I was going to write books. Like, that wasn't a thing in my mind. It just wasn't. That's not to say it wasn't in me. It just took a whole lot of people around me looking at me and saying, hey, your stories are really powerful to me. I love your music, but man, your stories, I remember them and I come back to listen to the stories. Or like I would teach at a church service, do some short reflection or whatever a bunch of years ago, and folks would give me feedback about that was really different than feedback about my music. And so I like letting the people around me see me and kind of identify for them, like this is what's vital about you right now. That's also a part of my creative process. Like, how do other people see me and see my work?
Sure. that's something we work with a lot of small businesses, mid-sized businesses, and doing advertising for them. You find your audience almost, and they give you feedback in what you're doing. So you
Yeah.
evolve. You do as a creative artist. Businesses do as providing services, and
Yeah.
I think that principle applies across both forms.
100%. Totally
Yeah.
buy that.
So in the audiobook, you talk about setting goals. That's really
Yeah.
interesting to me. Setting smaller, easier goals that you can manage your progress so you can actually achieve larger ones.
Yeah.
Just personally, I started jogging and hiking again recently after a long
Yeah.
time of not being physically active. And it
It's a
was,
beast. It's a beast of a commitment, bro.
oh yeah, oh yeah. But it was really, when I heard that part of your book, audiobook, it really registered with me because it was so important for me to make small goals. Just,
Yeah.
run another 50 yards each day. So I didn't frustrate myself because I knew
Yep.
if I didn't make the goals I was setting, I was going to get frustrated and just give up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So my
Yeah.
question to you about that is, at what point as an artist, as a person, do you feel it's healthy to push yourself with larger, more challenging goals where you might fall on your face?
Yeah. Well, I think they're kind of there's layers to that answer. The one is initially, I'll try to work backwards from this. I'll do my best. Like until you've actually accomplished something large, you have like no real gauge on what that feels like and what your self expectations should be like. You have literally no idea. What's it
Sure.
going to cost you? What's it going to cost financially? Like you have no idea until you actually get there. And so to some degree, like in order to answer that question like fully, like you have to have had some sort of large success, and that almost always happens by accident initially, or at least kind of like you find yourself kind of close to completion on some project or whatever, or the major project in your mind, it's not actually that huge, it's just really big to you, if that makes some sense. Like
Yeah.
emotionally, like this is huge to launch a blog. Like I got it designed, I've got a friend to take a picture, and I've got a blog up, and I put my first blog post up. Like for some folks, like that is massive. And once you've had that, then you have a little bit of a sense of, of kind of context for, like I said, a major goal.
Mm-hmm.
Working backwards, like the larger, I guess, like the actually larger your goals are, the bigger your dreams are, the more important it is to actually to not lock in on completion as the only acceptable measure of success, if that makes some sense. Like,
Very much.
so if my big goal is to launch a blog, to launch a blog page, then like that's like, if you don't get that page up, then like, okay, that's cool. And but you miss on that. I'll try to say it like this. My big goals used to be pretty small. In actuality, they actually be pretty small. Like again, like getting a blog up and, buying a URL.
Right.
And well, those are actually pretty small things. So like holding myself to that initially big goal, like I get that. But if it's like, I'm going to launch a full blown web page and start a career as a blogger and, public communicator around issue X, Y, and Z. Well, between that dream and the completion of that dream, or the execution of that dream, there are lots more actually like full blown achievables.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way. I think making a little bit of sense here. Like
absolutely.
there are actual small steps. There are resting places along that journey. Launching a blog is like you launch the blog or you don't. Like that's a small step, even if it's big to you. Once you have a larger goal, it's why I use the analogy in the first book called Title Pending about creativity. It's why I use hiking as an analogy, and your situation is actually key to this, because
Yeah.
like you see the mountain and you want to peak the mountain, but in hiking a mountain, like, Mount Diablo near here is the image I keep using. It's 7 miles. It's 1,400 feet. It's like not 14,000, 1,400. And, well, it's a pretty significant task to do, in an afternoon hike. If I just set out like if I don't take advantage of the resting spots of here's a place to pull over and consider this at least a momentary success, then I'm going to wear myself out. I'm going to quit on the project because I've set this massive expectation of hiking the whole hill or whatever. So all of that in context, like at what point do you have to push yourself? Really, once you've had some like legitimate successes, like once you've actually finished some projects, like 2, 3, 4 projects, then you get to like set some larger goals. Because of what I said at first, like what you think are big goals at first aren't actually big goals. So you don't know what you're talking about when early on it's like, hey, it's a massive goal. Bro, you don't know what a massive goal looks like yet because you haven't achieved anything yet. And B, like having done that massive goal, you can't really push yourself way out until you can settle for your smaller goals. Like you have to be able to settle for the step by step by step by step if you want to push yourself to massive successes. In other words, like the game never really changes. Like you never go beyond, you never graduate, I would suggest, from one small step to the next small step. You just get better at taking those small steps.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think the big picture goals get larger. I don't think the process changes.
That's really interesting. I had a conversation with another marketing person recently, how the expert is someone who will be able to break down a large goal into a lot of small pieces or a lot of small steps. And
yes,
what you're talking about in as you get better at those small steps, you gain confidence and it becomes something bigger than the pieces.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, and then you also know what it is you've accomplished, right? I mean, you've paid attention to it. Sets you up to actually do the next thing. Like if you pay attention to your small steps and your small goals, you actually are paying attention to your process, which sets you up then to be more audacious about your next goal. Because you can settle for your small steps and you realize, okay, there is this whole time period at the very beginning where like I'm sitting in front of Excel spreadsheets making marks with red and black pen. Yeah. And this is not what I want to be doing, but I know that this is a small step and that at some point we're going to peak the mountain. You have to get familiar with that so that you can do the next big work.
Yep. Totally. That's great. You mentioned in the audiobook, making the decision to finish something allows us to start. And yeah. I think there's some convergence that we see in advertising and market research with that, where consumers, when they're faced with too many product choices, they'll become exhausted and they might not even make any choice at all. Do you think intentionally limiting your options allows you more creative freedom?
100%. 100%. I think maybe even this is probably a little judgmental, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say most often when I have, or the people I have worked with are like stuck because we're dealing with too many options, it's really because I don't want to do the work. It's really because I don't actually want to make a decision. That's a way to avoid making a decision and taking the risk of saying like, well, there's so many options, right? It's sort of like one of the, like, there are two parallels I can think of. The one, there may be a little bit of a gap here. We'll see if this parallel works. Is one of the things I get to do is advocate on behalf of kids who live in poverty in different parts of the world. Yeah. And I'll tell stories and I'll invite folks to sponsor kids for $1.23 a day and rescue kids out of poverty. And they'll come to the table after like a presentation at a college or a church service. And one of the things I'll hear, and I would say like 80% of the time it's, well, 20% of the time I think this is sincere. I think 80% of the time it's something else. Some folks will go, oh my gosh, this is just kind of overwhelming. This is all new to me. I'm not sure what I want to do. Other times it's like, oh my gosh, I just want to sponsor them all. I don't know what to do, and then they'll move on. Instead, and I think it's a way of saying like, I'm not really sure I want to do this.
Okay.
Instead of like picking the one. No, it's actually totally sufficient for you to pick the one, because you can't sponsor, the 50 kids on the table. You can pick the one. So you don't really want to get involved in the work overall. Like, you don't really want to put your feet in the thing. And this, like, I get it. Like, you want people who get involved with global poverty. Like, it gets messy and you get emotionally tied up. So we do the same thing with options, whether it's creative options or business options or relationship options.
Yeah.
Like, it's a way for us to avoid making a decision, which is, in other words, it's a way for us to avoid taking the risk of being wrong, of failing. So it's not really ever, almost ever about the options. It's about failure. It's about fear.
The fear of the failure. Yeah, absolutely.
100%. 80%, not 100%. It's 80% true that for folks, it's about fear of failure and not really about the paralysis of options. So there was this great TED talk about, and you're probably familiar with it, and I'm going to blank on the gal's name. She's absolutely brilliant. She's blind, and she does this talk about people picking mustards at this like kind of boutique-y grocery store.
Oh.
And they touted. Are you familiar with this talk?
That's great. I'm familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. Wrote something about mustard.
Maybe it was. I might be confusing a couple of these two things, or maybe she retold the Gladwell story. But the long story made short was this boutique grocery store like touted their mustard selection as this like, hey, we have 200 kinds of mustards.
Yeah.
And people would go to the mustard aisle and be like, damn, like, what do I do with 200 kinds of mustards? And it was neat, and people would kind of check it all out. And this gal came in and said, pare it down to 10 or something like that, like 10 or 12 or 20. And they were like, hold on, wait. The whole thing is all the options. And she got them to take the risk of paring the choices down from 200 or whatever it was to a really small handful. And their sales went bonkers. Nice. Because like the vibe of choice, it's great. We want to make a choice, and we want to make an excellent choice. But it's not really about the product. Again, it's about me being right. And me being right is about fear of failure. And so if I can limit my options, I limit the ways, like sort of the doorways through which I can slip through and be afraid of failure. I think almost every time limiting your options like increases your capacity for risk, increases your capacity for creativity, forces you into places where you have to make decisions you wouldn't otherwise make. I think limitation's a gift, 100%.
Yeah. Forcing yourself to put limitations on yourself, I found in my personal life is important, and that absolutely carries over to, I think, art and business and marketing.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And the deal is like, it's like a deadline, and you and I are both familiar with like what it's like to work with or without deadlines.
Absolutely.
And I have no shame in saying this happened last week for me. I have had this book. My buddy Scott and I put together a book a couple years ago on the practice of prayer, and it went really well. And we've been talking about doing a second edition of it. And I've had these scraps and pieces and bits of the next projects around this book laying around. And it wasn't until I did this to myself. I called my editor. Her name's Grace Farag. She's a phenomenal editor, lives in Los Angeles, and I said, hey, I'd love to have you on this project. What's your timeline look like? And she said, well, I'd have to have something in my hand by the end of this, by the end of this week or early next week. Uh-huh. And it wasn't until she actually laid down that, like, here's your deadline. Like, all of a sudden, I had all this energy around the project. It was the only thing I was thinking of. I was making extra time for it. And during that extra time, like, new ideas. And I got, not only did I get it done, but like stuff came out of me that if had I just said like I'll finish it wherever I feel like finishing it, I'm positive those things wouldn't have bubbled to the surface. I think limitation almost always does that, where it sort of squeezes goodness out of us in our process.
I like that. Squeeze goodness. Absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah.
Like mustard. See how we bring it full circle. The whole thing's about mustard.
Absolutely. I'm going to have some after this.
There we go.
So I got one more question for you. Time's running a little short for us, but so as someone who makes your living from creativity, from creating art, you're you're also essentially a business owner, and you do your own marketing. How much time would you say you put into your business and marketing yourself side compared to creating your work? And
Yeah.
what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned in marketing yourself?
Huh. So a few answers here. One is the amount of time I'm putting into the more businessy like angles of what I do. It really depends on the season.
Hmm.
So in some seasons, I'm spending a lot more time making booking phone calls and doing marketing oriented stuff and logistics. And some seasons are more heavily, creative. The caveat to that, or sort of the maybe an important bit of clarity about that, is I get to choose to some great degree like how those seasons flow, if that makes any sense. In other words, like
Yeah.
I'm trying not to let myself be at the whim of urgencies. Like I've got to get this done here. This is this thing. I actually set the calendar. So my like as my weeks look, Monday ends up being kind of a like a kickstart type day. Like what's the week look like? What are the things I have? It's sort of like a check-in. And if I get some extra stuff done, it ends up being kind of more creative stuff. But basically, like I look through emails and I look through like I just have the big checklist and I get myself set up for the work week. Tuesday is a creative day and I'm focused on making, and that's what I'm doing during that day. I'm creating, whether that's shooting video or editing video. It's got to be a creatively oriented thing.
Hmm.
Or writing or whatever.
Yeah.
Wednesday is logistics. It's booking. It's answering emails. It's bills. It's like all of like just all the stuff that's like life sucking and terrible. That stuff happens on Wednesdays. Thursday again is a creative day, and then today is like more of a catch-all where like, okay, what do we not get done? Like what didn't get hit? Can I finish it before the weekend, or do I need to push it to Monday? And so I structure my week that way.
Yeah.
I also then end up structuring my year that way, so that I look at like I'm looking over here to my left. Not that it matters to your listeners, but I am looking to my left. And on the wall to my left is a physical calendar of the entire year. And I have things mapped out, not hyper specifically, but in seasons where like, hey, this is a particular month like where this thing is happening. So like I'm wrapping up recording and editing for season 2 of the At Sea podcast in August. And in August, I am trying to finish this book proposal. And that's what August ends up being about. So I have this, like, that's the season in which that takes place. And then come, the second half of August, that's July. And then come the second half of July and the beginning of August, a lot of it is logistics in terms of booking and connections with people and making sure that I'm going to be traveling and, and speaking and playing places. So like I actually map out those seasons.
Yeah.
So that I'm not getting pushed around by my calendar, but that I'm using my calendar to hold, like, this is what to hold the time for what it belongs, to hold the time accountable to me. Like you're accountable to me because it's my life and you don't get to tell me how to run it, even though you're the clock.
I think this is really interesting because I think a lot of people think about artists and creative types as being very unstructured. But
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about a lot of structure, if not hyper structured, at
Yeah.
least outlined. And
Yeah.
I think that also goes back to what we were talking about limiting choices.
Yes, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And the back half of the question here, when you talk about like what would you say is the most important lesson I've learned in marketing, or in marketing myself, this is 100% true. It sounds weird, it feels weird. And if you haven't lived into it, it doesn't seem like it's true, but I completely and totally mean this. It's the same work. So when I'm writing, when I'm connecting with people, when I'm face to face with someone, when I'm speaking from stage, when I'm behind the guitar, when I'm writing an email, when I'm answering emails, like all of that, it's the same work.
Yeah.
And I do it with the same posture, and I do it with the same motivation, and I do it with the same energy. Like and all of this because it's me. And if I divide myself psychologically, emotionally, spiritually into like this is my logistical side over here, and this is my creative side over here, then both parts end up suffering. As a creative, I do logistics in a way, like being able to look at my calendar and work through seasons like that. Well, that's kind of a creative decision.
Sure.
Not, but also figuring out how to structure a book and what things to include or not include, or how, like that's about logistics. It's actually all one massive work. It's my life's work. And I have to approach it, or want to approach it, with the same spirit, with the same intention, with the same love for the people who will be impacted by it. So that's the biggest lesson. It's like, it's not like this is the crap I have to do so that I can do the stuff I love. No. You do all of it because you love people.
I love that answer. That's great.
Thanks.
All right. That's about all the time we have today. I want to thank Justin for joining us.
You're quite welcome, man. Thanks a ton.
Yeah, and I think it's been a great conversation. For all listeners out there, make sure you check out Justin's work. You can find him at justinmcroberts.com. And be sure to check out his new audiobook. We'll have a link to that on our page. We hope you enjoyed our podcast, and we'll see you next time.